She stood at the service entrance with a broom in one hand and a paper towel in the other. The hem of her jacket darkened where it had brushed the floor. Outside, plate glass doors opened onto a ballroom that smelled of butter and flowers, and a kind of wealth that spoke in crystal and cloth napkins. Inside, 500 people were supposed to be watching a singer they had all come to hear. Outside, Elizabeth Parker pushed a cart of cleared silverware, her other hand flat against the small round bulge at her belly to steady herself on the stairs. The juxtaposition was immediate enough to feel cruel. Her scuffed sneaker caught on a stray ribbon as a valet in polished shoes swept by. The hush of the service corridor absorbed laughter, leaking like perfume through a crack in the double doors. She wiped the rim of a tray the way a person wipes away an old ache, careful, methodical, pretending sanitation could somehow reorder everything that felt messy. A dropped napkin lay like a snow patch at her feet. She picked it up, folded it, and tucked it into the cart. She had not been allowed past the staff's back hallway when she'd first arrived at the Golden Palace, and she hadn't wanted to be. But hunger is a practical education. She had learned how to move, so a security guard saw only the honest work of a helper. How to look like someone who belonged with a name badge that wasn't hers. Tonight, she had tied a borrowed scarf to her hair, slipped an old coat over an apron, and told Thomas at the service door that she could help with clearing. His first impulse had been to send her away. He had folded his arms and scanned her with the same economy of attention he gave to every human question in the basement shifts. But she had eyes that did not beg even when they were saying so, and Thomas found himself nodding as if to be rid of the small argument. "We're short staff," he had muttered. "You do the trays. Don't be in the way." She had said, "Yes, sir," and the words were more like promises. The hotel smelled of oranges and butter, and a kind of money that had learned how to be polite to itself. The main ballroom glowed, big chandeliers, silk tablecloths, the couple's initials spelled in flowers on a raised dais. Sarah and Michael, at the center of it all, smiled with the clean brightness of people whose lives had been built on certainty. They were the color of thread in that tapestry, fine and hard to touch. Bridesmaids flitted like well-dressed birds. Guests in gowns and tuxedo tails told themselves they were celebrating love, while counting favors beneath their napkins. Then, 20 minutes before the grand entrance, Patricia ran through the door like a woman with a leash on a hurricane. Her nails clicked, her voice was a series of efficient commands. The headline performer had called. Last minute no show. There would be no headline. $55,000 linens and 500 hungry eyes, and not a note to fill them. Victor Ryson stood at the far end of the room with a glass of whiskey in one hand and a phone in the other. He favored the quiet corner. He always had, even in rooms meant to flatter him. He watched people perform their consternation like an editor might catalog typos on a manuscript. He was a man made spectacular by restraint. The Ryson fortune had built a tower of kindnesses that read like investments. Philanthropy had been measured and precise, delivered in quarterly gifts and named chairs. In his youth, Victor had learned to measure his hunger, so it would not show. Born on the other side of a river and named from a street that smelled of coal dust and boiled cabbage, he had granted himself a sort of promise, never to be embarrassed by need again, never to feel small in a room. That old hunger sat in him like a map that folded neatly into a pocket. It sometimes loosened its edges. Patricia scanned the crowd and then turned to the small staff cluster in the service hall. "We need something. Singers, a toast, anything. James, you can't do the whole set. Guests are asking." She looked to the doorway where a few people loitered with plates and polite irritation. "No one else?" Her glance flicked to the double doors. "Back guest, someone, anyone who can make a decent entrance?" Elizabeth heard it from the other side of the door as if the words had been cast and she could choose to step into the cast or not. Her hands paused mid-sweep. Her heart made a small sound that had nothing to do with the baby. A performer canceling was a storm that opened windows to small possibilities. She had not come to the Golden Palace to perform. She came because the aroma of roast, because a flyer slipped from a doorknob had said, "Wedding Saturday," and the neighborhood clock said rent was due. She had been on the bench by the river 2 nights ago, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't quite hers, and the bread she had found had been dry but honest. She had arrived at the service gate with no illusions about what she could offer. She could wipe plates and push carts and not be in the way. It was work, not spectacle, but hunger rearranges courage into actions. It had a geometry. "What if," she started, and stopped because the word would sound presumptuous in the noise. Thomas glanced at her, the man who had been a gate between rooms and had the practice of seeing what needed to be seen. He was not unkind. "You?" he said. His voice contained more questions than the room allowed. "Yes," she answered in the small, steady way people use to anchor themselves. "I sing if you want." There was a pause, and in that pause a laugh from somewhere inside like a thrown pebble. Some guests heard and turned with the curiosity of boredom. Someone called out, "Aren't you the cleaner?" like a punchline, and the sound rippled. Amusement, a kind of appetite for spectacle. Patricia's eyes were steel. "We can't have an amateur up there." The sentence was the kind of practical cruelty that lives in order. She was thinking of the couple, of the motion of their social world. "Security, remove her." Before Thomas could move, a voice cut across the corridor like a scalpel. "Hold." It was Victor. He had watched the exchange with that flat attention he had cultivated, and when he spoke, the word was simple enough to stop small proceedings. He came forward, his jacket buttoned, glass still in hand. He looked at Elizabeth like someone reading a ledger that had an unexpected footnote. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elizabeth," she said. "Elizabeth what?" He had the tempered man's bad habit of wanting names to be complete before compassion might be dispensed. "Parker," she added. "Elizabeth Parker." He looked at her as if reading the surname would tell him whether to grant leniency. He had the look of a man who had learned to be politely cruel when necessary, but tonight his face carried something else, an old echo of hunger. He remembered a narrow kitchen with a window that didn't close all the way, a mother who sang a tune with no words because there were none, a boy who learned there were people who simply moved around hunger like it was weather to dress against. "All right," he said. "If you're willing to do something, I'll make it worth your while. You sing one song, you keep this room silent, every single person. If they listen, if they stay quiet through your song, you walk away with $15,000. The number landed like a piece of thunder. It stunned the back hall into a clean sound. Patricia's eyebrows went up and then down again in a calculation. The staff muttered. Thomas blinked. Somewhere across the room a fork stopped midair. $15,000. Enough to rent an apartment for a stretch, to fill an account with a cushion, to physics, ally, change the ledger of immediate fear. Elizabeth felt her mouth go dry. That amount meant briefly a kind of breathing room, prenatal vitamins without the barter of credit, a deposit, someone to answer the phone without the trembling that had become instinct. But she also felt the size of the stage, the weight of being made spectacle. The proposal was a challenge wrapped in a test. Victor watched her the way one might watch a horse be tempted by an open gate. "No tricks," he said. "If you can make them quiet for the length of one song, the money is yours. If they laugh or talk, the offer stands void." It was not a gift. It was a wager. Elizabeth heard both things at once, the hope and the conditions. She looked at Thomas, at Patricia, at the corridor light that slanted across her hand. Her thumb brushed the inside of her coat where a phone slept with its cracked screen. Her other hand felt the familiar curve of her belly through the fabric. She had a life growing inside her that had no contractual protections against the world. She had a vow she had kept to herself in the loneliest hours. No matter how things bent, she would keep a part of herself unbroken for the child. "Okay," she said. The word was not dramatic. It was an alignment, a stepping into measurement. "I'll do it." A ripple ran through the staff. Patricia blinked once, then clapped briskly, as if to move everyone into a choreography. "James!" she called to the house pianist who sat waiting by the grand in a shadowed corner. He was a narrow man with kind hands and the kind of face that had learned to be companionable in 100 small sets. "Accompany her. Keep it gentle. and no applause until the end. James nodded. He rolled his shoulders and walked toward the piano, fingers warm with the habit of keys. He glanced at Elizabeth and gave the small, solemn lift of someone acknowledging an understanding. The piano's lacquer shone like a black eye watching the room. Backstage, Elizabeth's hands found the rail of the stage like a person taking a step over cold water. The staff had put a simple robe over her borrowed apron so she wouldn't look like what she was doing in the corridor. Someone handed her a microphone. It felt heavy and unfamiliar, and the cable twined like a rope under it. James sat and played a few notes as if negotiating the space, a small, warming preface that the room took as professional courtesy rather than community. In the darkened wing where she waited, the chorus of the ballroom became a distant sea. Voices thinned as the doors closed. The threshold was a membrane between worlds. Elizabeth pressed her hand against the microphone stand as if she were steadying more than a piece of metal, steadying herself, steadying a promise. The baby moved, and she felt the movement like the answer to everything. Memories came with the weird bluntness of hunger. The bench by the river that had been a bed for a night too many. The smell of someone else's laundry that had felt like home. Her mother humming a tune with no words while mending a collar. Her mother had had a throat full of song and no stage. She would hum when the radio was too expensive. It was less a melody than a memory made audible, long vowels and breath marks that must have meant more to her than words ever could. Elizabeth had taken that hush into her voice like a braid. She had learned that when words failed, tone did not. She had learned to make music from the space between syllables, because sometimes the story of being hungry sits between the ticks of a clock. Daniel's face hovered then too, not as a ghost, but as an unfinished sentence. He had left when the baby was a plan and bills were louder than promises. He called 2 weeks ago from a number she did not recognize, voice rough as if someone had been drinking between regrets. "I want to be there," he had said, like an offer that only needed a yes to be different. Elizabeth had listened to the reading of his growth, the way his words folded around excuses. She had told him truth, that being present required more than a voice on a phone, that the child deserved someone who showed up. He pressed. She set boundaries. She told him she would accept his help in time, but not now, not as a lifeline that lifted his guilt faster than his axe. He was allowed to make amends, but only by proving himself through steady steps. He had not liked it. He had called again last week and left a message that said he would try. She had listened. She believed in change, but she also believed in caution when it came to the marrow of a child's life. Backstage, time thinned into small increments. Patricia came and went like a scheduler with a pulse. Thomas supplied a discreet bottle of water. James tuned his fingers like a ritual. Victor, who had every right to remain in the ballroom and observe the social effect of his gambit, peered from the wings, the glint of his eye measuring the room and measuring Elizabeth. He did not approach her. His physics of space reserved a place for distance. He had made the wager, yes, but it was not charity given with both hands. He was curious to see whether something honest could happen in the middle of a social collision. Elizabeth closed her eyes for a breath. She had not sung for a crowd this size ever, but she had sung to more critical listeners, the ones in shelters whose applause came in the form of warm hands or a sharing of a sandwich. She had sung to herself in the night so that the baby would hear a voice, and so she could pretend that everything would be all right. The music she carried was not the polished, practiced tone of conservatory. It was a wordless thing that filled spaces with meaning. She had learned, in the absence of resources, how to be economical with sound, using silence like a chord, bending vowels so notes had to lean into the listener. There was a small rehearsal, a few measured notes from James, as if they were arranging furniture before a guest arrived. He waited for her cue. She nodded. The room beyond the curtain did what rooms do. Interest turned toward the stage out of curiosity or boredom, or the ancient human hunger to watch risk. A ripple of low laughter went through the guests when she stepped out, a soft animal sound of people amused by the daring of novelty. Some mouths formed the word cleaner, as if it were a profession that could be an entire identity. A few phones raised like small altars flash in the dark. Elizabeth felt hands press the mic to her. They had placed it at the perfect height, capturing not only a voice but the hush that preceded it. She had not expected the attention, and she did not need its validation. The microphone looked smaller than she imagined, the cord a lifeline to something she had not named. In the front row, a woman with pearls twisted and leaned toward her husband. A child stared, both curious and unimpressed. Someone who owned a hospitality empire watched with a whiskey glass, making a lens of his knuckles. The couple's mother dabbed at her cheeks with a napkin as if she were already anticipating how the evening would be commented on in columns and group chats. Elizabeth breathed once, as if testing the air. There was the surgeon-like moment before incision. The room inhaled back. James laid his hands on the keys and struck a chord that was neither major nor minor, something between a question and a cradle. He did not play an arrangement or a flourish. He set down a bed of sound, a sparse piano figure that asked for a presence, and then receded. Her voice answered. It rose without words, a sound that came in a place where language had been stripped down to vocabulary of size and vowel shapes. It was a wordless song her mother had hummed in the dark. It was a call and a reply. The melody shaped itself against the sweep of James's chords like a hand finding the outline of another. It was not showy. It had no pyrotechnics. It had a truth like raw linen, coarse, honest, not designed to be pleasing to rich tastes. At first, guests rustled as if to shift from laughter to polite attention. Some were impatient. Some had expected a spectacle and felt cheated. But the sound held. It was as if each note carried a light, and the room had the instinct to stop and see how the light would strike. Victor watched with a face that made no claims to joy. He had wagered on silence, but what he found more compelling was that old hunger's echo in the sound. For a moment he felt an old, private uncomfort, a small, telescoped memory of a night when the future seemed to be a closed door. He had made many calculated gestures in his life. This was an experiment in how much of a person a moment could restructure. He told himself he would not be easily moved. Still, the edges of his eyes softened. Backstage, people who had dismissed the idea of this unknown singer turned their heads as if a tide had pulled them. Patricia's hands were folded at her chest. She looked like a woman seeing the implications of something she had only managed logistically. Thomas loosened, his shoulders moving like a gate eased. A few guests lowered their phones, their modern sacrament. The sound was filling the room with a quality that, for the first time that evening, felt beyond the reach of money. Elizabeth's song had no words, but it had an anatomy. Rise, fall, a place where held notes made breath-heavy spaces like rooms with doors closing. When it reached those suspended spots, the ballroom did not murmur. The sound made people remember small things, the smell of a childhood kitchen, a grandmother's lullaby, a summer that had an end only in the distance. Some faces crumpled like tissues being folded down to keep something safe. A woman in the third row hid a tear in the crease of her napkin. A businessman with a ledger in his head let the pen fall from his fingers and watched his hands simply rest. The hush contracted until it seemed physical, a weight that settled on the tables and chandeliers. Elizabeth felt the space of the room change around the song. The sound came from somewhere deep in her ribs and traveled outwards, honest as an anatomy lesson. For a second she forgot about the money, the check that might buy diapers, the appointment she needed to make with a doctor. There was only the truth of the notes and the small, bright fact of the baby moving against her hand as if in approval. The first block of the night, the chaos of a cancelled act, the improbable invitation, had turned into a hush that made people lean into their own private reflections. If this moment were an organ, it had shifted from the frenetic energy of a social gathering into a cathedral. The change was delicate and terrible. It required people to stop performing their importance and simply listen. If this story is the kind of thing that moves you and you'd like to hear more about Elizabeth's journey, what comes after this night, how a check and a key can change lives, please like and subscribe to follow her path. It's small, but it helps bring more stories like this forward. The hush swelled and held. Elizabeth could feel it as a thing that was both fragile and relentless. She had not set out to teach anyone anything. She had set out to keep a promise to herself and to the small life inside her. But what one person sings can, in a room of 500, become a mirror in which strange private reckonings happen. People in uniformed suits watched as if they had been given a pause in which to reconsider the urgency of some email. A teenager who had been scrolling through music videos with a practiced indifference now sat forward and forgot the rest of his world for a beat. Victor listened as if the sound had a particular address. He remembered streets where people had listened to the radio until it was their only window into beauty. He had never wanted to be sentimental about his past, because sentimentality, in his experience, was often a business cost. Yet there was a moment under the chandelier when his chest tightened, and he understood the thin geometry of redemption, not a ceremony, but a series of small, practical choices. The singer's final note hung like a coin in the air, and then dissolved into the kind of silence the room had not known at the beginning of the night. The silence did not break into applause immediately. It waited, as if to ask for permission to be generous. In that wait, Elizabeth had every reason to feel exposed. She felt the sweat on her temple and the beating of her heart as if the baby kept time with it. She felt the gap between the back hallway and the stage, like a fault line. But then the room did something that felt honest. A single hand rose, not out of obligation, not from a prearranged cue, but slowly, like a person surfacing. Others followed. A standing wave of private approval rolled through chairs and tuxedos. Applause came in cascades. It had the force of people deciding to be moved. Patricia's face was a map of recalculations. She took a breath and stepped forward, making a practical bridge between spectacle and consequence. The business of an evening had shifted from performance to acknowledgement, and that required arranging new logistics. Victor stepped toward the stage with a deliberate gait. He had made the bet in front of 500 others. He intended to settle it. His steps were measured like a man closing a boardroom agreement. He took the microphone and for once that night spoke without the careful armor he tended to wear. "You kept the room silent," he said. His voice had the clarity of someone who expected both accuracy and theater. "You win." He reached into his pocket and produced an envelope, as if he were pulling an old practice out of the past where currency came in paper and sealed motions. The envelope, when opened, revealed a check folded like a small boat. He pushed it toward her with a formality that read as both concession and transaction. $15,000, he said, the number crisp in the air. And an offer. We have a small performance space at the Harrington Hotel. A residency can be arranged. Training will be a condition. We don't do miracles here, but we do provide support. The generosity of the gesture was matched by the coldness of the conditions, and yet neither made the other invalid. She accepted the envelope with two hands, as if accepting both currency and an instruction manual. The check was not a cure, only a beginning. But it was a beginning rooted in specificity. A bank account could be opened, a deposit made, a sequence of appointments scheduled for prenatal care. Victoria's words balanced praise and policy. The public part of the deal had been fulfilled, and now the private work would begin. Backstage, Patricia had already moved into the mode she knew best: logistics. She gathered Elizabeth's contact information, ensured she had a safe hotel room for the night, and clipped a note into her hand about a social worker who could help with prenatal appointments. Thomas, who had guarded the threshold with the guarded patience of someone who saw a lot of human variation, offered a small, deferential smile that contained something like apology. Elizabeth stood with the check closed in a palm that trembled not so much from nerves as from the recognition that the world had shifted its axis on a hinge the size of a song. It was not salvation, it was support. It came with an understanding that work, training, boundaries would be required. She had not been bought off with praise. She had been offered specific instruments to rebuild. The applause ran on like a river that had finally found its bed. Elizabeth felt the baby respond again, as if answering a call from a future voice. On the far side of the room, a man in a suit with a nameplate took a note for the residency terms, and James folded his hands like someone finishing a prayer he had not meant to say aloud. The wedding proceeded, bettered now by a strange communal memory that would travel home with guests in the form of a story they would tell as if they had been present at a small miracle. But not every movement that looks like kindness comes without cost or complexity. Someone in the crowd whispered about what this gesture meant: a billionaire, a check, a performance that had been sold on a wager. Conversation would orbit these facts in columns and coffee shops. There would be questions about motives and critics, who would say Victor used the moment to polish a reputation. Elizabeth didn't have the energy for the meta-narrative that would bloom in other people's mouths. She had a baby inside her, an envelope in her coat, an appointment that might have to be made. As the room began its slow reconstruction from a social storm into celebration, Elizabeth's phone vibrated in her pocket. The cracked screen lit up with a name she had hoped not to see so soon: Daniel. Her hands felt the check heavier, like an obligation that had not yet been unwrapped. For a heartbeat, she considered ignoring it, then pressed the green button. "Hello?" she said. "Liz?" his voice said. It was a voice carrying 100 small regrets. "I saw on social. Are you okay? I want to come. I want to be there. For you. For the baby." She could hear not only the words, but the hope folded into them, the expectation that the world could be set aright with the pronoun I. Elizabeth listened as if tasting a broth that might be thin. "Daniel," she said, "I'm not asking for you to fix anything tonight. I'm asking you to show, over time, not words, actions, proof." He hesitated, the kind of silence that means someone is thinking about how he might be forgiven without giving up what made him comfortable. "I can do that," he said. You can start by coming on the dates we agree," she interrupted, not unkindly but with a line drawn in the sand. "You can start by going to the first appointment I make with Dr. Reeves. And you can start by showing up to the next meeting with Margaret, the voice teacher. If you want to be part of this child's life, I'm not telling you no forever. I'm telling you there are terms." He swallowed audibly. "Terms?" he repeated, a man encountering discipline for the first time in a while. "Yes," she said. The word had a firmness like a door bolted. "If you want to be here, I need you to do the work, not the talk. That's all." A pause. Then, "I'll do it." Whether he meant it in flesh or only in breath, she could not know. What she could hold was the decision that she would not gamble her baby's life on promises that were thin as tissue. The night wound down into practicalities. Patricia handed Elizabeth a credit for a hotel stay, a number for a social worker, an appointment time. Thomas offered a taxi card with a small professional smile. James packed his sheet music with a quiet shrug. Victor retreated to his seat, the man who had made a public wager and then privatized his consequences. He watched Elizabeth with an expression that had softened in places he had not expected to soften. He had witnessed an estrangement between sound and money and found it instructive. Elizabeth, with a folded check pressed into the inner pocket of a coat that smelled faintly of the ballroom and of lemon cleaner, felt the weight of decisions steady against her chest. The night had changed her trajectory, but it had not finished the work. There were referrals to be made, names to be called, a bank account to open without a permanent address to register. There was a doctor named Dr. Reeves who would need a call. There was a teacher named Margaret who would want to meet her voice not as a spectacle, but as a craft. She climbed into the taxi with Patricia's hotel card, and Thomas's small, earnest squeeze on her shoulder. The city outside the cab hummed with late-night traffic. The Golden Palace receded into a pool of light in the rearview mirror. Elizabeth watched the reflection of the chandelier pass over the taxi's upholstery and felt, for the first time in months, the idea of a plan that had more than a day in it. The hotel room smelled of a linen the house had not yet deemed its own. She closed the door and took the check from her pocket, staring at the neat script. The number looked like a promise written by someone who understood the weight of numbers. She folded it in her hands again and again until the edges softened. She did not sleep much. The night of applause translated into a kind of insomnia where she made lists in the dark. Dr. Reeves, appointment. Margaret, voice lesson schedule. Bank, open account, deposit, safety, Daniel, boundaries. Each item had its own moral arithmetic. Each item required new courage. Morning came like a careful thing. The sunlight in her hotel room was filtered through a blind and looked like approval. She dressed in the same borrowed coat and walked to the little concierge desk where Patricia had placed a call to arrange follow-up. The staff at the Golden Palace were efficient and brisk. The world of hospitality knows how to convert social wonders into logistics. A name was recorded. A card was given. Someone told her there was a car to take her to a clinic in an hour. When she walked out into the street, the city had the ordinary face of itself. Coffee shops with people who read newspapers, buses with commuters, a woman jogging with a phone in an armband. The envelope in her pocket made a soft indentation on her thigh. She had to remind herself that money changes the immediate possibility of choices. It did not erase the days she had gone hungry, or the nights she had sheltered under a single blanket that smelled of other people's laundry. What it did do was make a kind of margin for breathing. Victor went back to his office that afternoon, where he kept a schedule with times for board meetings and times for thinking. He had a small ritual of making his assistant call Meridian, his philanthropic arm, and note the need for an initial arrangement. He did not make grand pronouncements. He preferred to do the work quietly. But tonight's wager had made him feel something unfamiliar. Accountable. He was used to being the person who paid for solutions. Now he felt like someone who might be learning to be present for those solutions in ways that carried obligation rather than headline. Elizabeth's first call was to Thomas, the man who had guarded the service door, and then, by economy of kindness, let her be. He offered a number for a social worker who ran out of the community clinic. He gave the address of a small gray building where appointments were given and forms were signed, and where often people learned how to keep adult things from unraveling by being practical. The receptionist smiled at her like someone who knew how to make forms into ladders. Dr. Reeves's office had a stack of pamphlets about prenatal care that smelled faintly of antiseptic and compassion. Elizabeth sat in the chair and let a nurse check her blood pressure, and then a doctor with tired hands and an efficient manner told her that there were steps they could take now that would change the child's horizon. By the end of the week, a small administration under Victor's philanthropy had already faxed over an agreement for the Harrington residency. The offer was not fame. It was steady work contingent on training and on a probationary 3-month mentorship. Margaret, a voice teacher whose life had been shaped by telling singers the difference between ego and instrument, would be assigned. Elizabeth read the contract in a diner where she ate toast with a hunger that had a new solidity to it. She signed it with a hand that trembled. The name on the paper would, in time, be associated with regular hours and pay stubs, and a sense of a week that had pattern. There were small humiliations nested in the salvation. Opening a bank account required an address. She used the hotel for the moment, and made a note to secure an apartment with the assistance they had promised. Daniel texted congratulations and an ask to come by. She told him not yet. He sent flowers to the Golden Palace via an anonymous account, and she felt the old tug of seeing gestural apologetics trying to be a shortcut. 2 weeks later, a key appeared in her hand. Patricia handed it across a small conference table, along with a list of next steps and a manila folder that contained the first check, an amount large enough to make a deposit and pay for a month of rent at a modest place called Meridian Apartments. The key itself was an ordinary thing, brass with a number stamped on the head, 412. It felt like the outline of a life. Elizabeth turned it in her fingers and cradled it like a seed. When she opened the door to 412, she felt the air of an apartment that had never been claimed. The walls were painted a neutral tone, a canvas waiting for small things. The sink had a small chip in the enamel. A closet held a single broom. The window looked onto a back alley that smelled faintly of coffee and an urgent city. It was small, but it was a room she could call her own. She knelt on the floor and imagined where the crib would go. She had a drawer to put clothes in. She had a place to hang a photograph. She closed the door and felt the sound of it as if it were a seal. In the days that followed, training began. Margaret appeared with a seriousness that felt like a good surgery, necessary and exact. She listened to Elizabeth's voice, and then told her what the voice did not know about its own music. James came in to coach repertoire and accompaniments. Victor's philanthropy arranged for a stipend for lessons. It was not a blank check for fame, but a practical plan to teach skill and to build routine. Elizabeth worked. She practiced scales and long tones, until her voice felt less like a thin thing borrowed from memory, and more like an instrument she could call by name. Margaret stopped her mid-run the first week and put a hand on Elizabeth's jaw, as if aligning more than resonance. "Center here," she said, patient and exact. "You're singing from your throat. Let it live lower. Let the breath be the boss." Her fingers were practical. Her corrections felt surgical and kind. She did not praise what was raw. She taught what could be honed. Elizabeth listened like someone learning a map. There were days when Margaret's critiques felt like cold water, and days when they felt like stitches. Both were useful. James became the constant in the background, the accompanist who arrived with a posture that said he had seen too many miracles to be surprised, and yet still watched with the care one gives an animal learning a new trick. He taught her phrasing, taught her how to leave space so a note could breathe. He taught her how to tilt a vowel so that a room felt invited rather than affronted. They worked on repertoire that would survive the bar's small stage. Standards turned into intimate conversations. A few originals Elizabeth had hummed through sleepless nights, and the old wordless lullaby her mother had given her, arranged now with piano counter-melodies that threaded like soft ropes. The practical scaffolding arrived, too, in gestures that felt durably useful. Victor's office set up a stipend that arrived on schedule in modest amounts. Never a spectacle, always an itemized ledger. Voice lessons, a modest rental deposit, medical bills covered, a short-term caseworker to help with paperwork, and on occasion supplies like a crib or a car seat. Patricia handled the logistics with an efficiency that made Elizabeth think of clean linens and timelines. She delivered the key to 412, and then delivered a list of appointments, names, and times. Thomas offered to check in. Linda, a cousin who lived 2 neighborhoods over and had always been someone who kept the good plates for holidays, turned up one evening with a cardboard box filled with tiny clothes and a floral lamp that smelled faintly like her own mother's house. It felt like cumulative life, small things that, when assembled, became a structure. There were moments when the past pressed in with a blunt, unhelpful insistence. One night after an early lesson when Margaret had pushed her to sculpt a phrase until it shone, Elizabeth walked past the riverbank out of habit and stopped where a bench remembered her. For a second she was transported. The blanket not quite warm, the echo of the city's cold breathing over the water. Her phone buzzed, an appointment reminder, and she tucked it away and kept walking. The bench had been part of her story. It would not be the whole of it. Daniel called more often than he had in the months before the wedding. His voice, when it came, carried the familiarity of a man trying to familiarize himself again with a life he had been estranged from. He attended the first prenatal appointment she scheduled with Dr. Reeves, though he arrived late and out of breath, eyes full of a contrite earnestness that had cost him nothing yet. Elizabeth sat in the small exam room and watched him watch the screen where the technician had frozen an image of the baby's profile. He reached out to brush her hand, and then pulled back when she did not offer the space. "You did good," he said, meaning the baby, meaning her. There was hope in his voice like a coin pressed to a palm. "You showed up today," Elizabeth answered, "and that's the start. The rest is proof. I need to see the appointments kept, not just the kind words." He promised again. He texted to confirm the next lesson with Margaret, then missed it. He left a note on her door a week later with an offer to take on some small bill. She returned it unopened and left a short message asking him to come that Thursday for a meeting with the caseworker and to sign up for classes they'd found. Parenting, budgeting. He came to one, stayed for half, and then left with the excuse of work. Each absence nudged Elizabeth toward the truth she had promised herself. She could hope and she could demand accountability. Victor's involvement remained careful and oddly ambivalent. He sent messages through his administrative channels more than personal ones, asking that Margaret and James be compensated and that the Harrington residency offer be formalized into a draft contract the team could discuss. He visited the Harrington in person once, not for Elizabeth's lesson, but to see the space where the residency would occur, an intimate barroom stage with a few dozen chairs and a hopeful brass nameplate. He liked details. He liked to make decisions where consequences could be calculated. He wrote notes in the margins of the residency draft, requests for periodic performance reviews, a clause that training must precede paid evenings out front, stipulations about scheduling and behavior that made him comfortable. It read like charity with parentheses. One afternoon, months into the rehearsals, Elizabeth was called to Victor's office. He was not there at the moment she arrived. Instead, his assistant ushered her into an anteroom with a glass wall that let in the city's flat horizon. The assistant closed the door softly behind her and left. When Victor entered, he did not hover over the theater of charity. He sat and said what he often did best. Few words, precise. "You've been training?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. 3 times a week with Margaret, twice with James, and my own practice. He nodded. He reached for a file and turned it so she could see the draft. Verbiage written in neat, borderline clerical paragraphs about the residency, the stipend, the probationary period. "I want you to know I'm serious about the structure," he said. "This isn't spectacle. If we do it properly." Elizabeth read the clauses and then looked at him. There was a cautiousness to his offer she could respect. She also had a growing sense of what she needed to keep herself from being ground by good intentions. "I'll agree to training first," she said, "but I need something practical in the contract. Childcare support for performance nights. I can't be at a bar gig and at the clinic at the same time." Victor's mouth tightened a little, a concession of the unexpectedly granular nature of generosity. "You'll have a stipend earmarked for childcare," he said, "and we'll supply the mentorship hours. If the residency goes well after 3 months, it will convert to a small regular contract." 3 months probation, she repeated, careful not to sound small. "It's a business decision," he said. "We want to see if this is sustainable." Elizabeth agreed, not because she was naive to the possibility of being judged, but because she knew how to make a plan that balanced required proof with ambition. She negotiated other small things: the right to keep a portion of lesson schedules for health appointments, a clause where James could sub in for accompaniment if she had to miss rehearsals for medical reasons, and an explicit commitment that the residency not be cancelled at the whim of seasonal booking without prior notice. It felt like setting boundaries with benefactors the way one might set a handrail. Outside Victor's office, she called Margaret and read her favorite line of the contract aloud, as if the sound of it would make it real. "Training first, then performance." Margaret laughed, a sound that had become a benediction. "You made them write the sensible thing," she said. "Good." The pressure of all this, public attention, private corrections, the thin architecture of new support, was not absent of strain. There were nights Elizabeth succumbed to the panic that comes with the ledger of living, the need to buy groceries, the worry over prenatal numbers, the fatigue that crept like a shadow across exercises and bound itself in her ribs. Once, after a long rehearsal, she found herself weeping in the small kitchen of 412 over a pot of instant soup that tasted like too many compromises. Linda sat with her and said what cousins say when they have a steady patience. She brought tea, a blanket, and a list of second-hand shops where one could find crib sheets on the cheap. "You're doing the exact things you promised yourself," Linda said. "Sometimes it looks messier than you imagine it, but it's still the same direction." Months ground on. Margaret pushed. James accompanied. Victor's office made payments on schedule and occasionally sent an admin to check in, often with the same businesslike care with which someone checks oil levels. Necessary, practical. The probationary period arrived with its own pressure. Elizabeth had a set of small gigs at the Harringtons' upstairs lounge, 3 nights in a month to begin. The crowd was not 500 under dripping chandeliers this time. It was 20 or 30 regulars and a smattering of curious passers-by. The lighting was humble. The chairs were wooden and honest. The bar smelled of lemon rinds and old spirits. Her first residency night was a test more of endurance than of artistry. She needed to balance a warm-up, a 4-song block, and a short conversation with the host. She had arranged for a sitter Patricia's office recommended, Maria, who had a calm face and 2 decades of experience, and a schedule for nights when she would be away from Dr. Reeves's strict appointment times. There were small successes. A regular told her his mother had been a singer in a church choir, and that her voice had lived on in him. A bartender asked if she had recordings. She said not yet. People left money in the jar that the Harrington kept for tip sharing, and Elizabeth received her first tiny pay stub, a modest line item that said performance $250. It was not $15,000. It was fodder for the next month's groceries and a sign that schedules could be converted into income. Critics would later have their small columns, what it meant for a billionaire to discover a singer at a wedding. But for those nights it was the steady, quiet work that mattered. Elizabeth kept her calendar, attended the lessons, showed up for check-ins with the residency manager, and sent text updates to the caseworker when she needed help arranging childcare or rescheduling a lesson because of a doctor's appointment. There was a new kind of muscle developing, the muscle of adult administration that keeps a life aligned. Daniel attempted to be more present as the months passed. He showed up to the clinic a handful of times, sometimes on time, sometimes late. He folded into Elizabeth's life in small ways that would have been unremarkable if they had been consistent. He bought a box of diapers. He painted a wall in the nursery, a pale green one weekend when he said he was trying. Elizabeth accepted the help that felt like responsibility and declined the gestures that felt like a shortcut to forgiveness. One afternoon, when he suggested they move in together, she put the hand to her chest and said what had become a core truth. I will accept help when you can show me you'll keep it. I'm not building a life on promises. This child deserves steadiness. He bristled, then nodded. He came to a parenting class and stayed for its entirety. It was enough for Elizabeth to keep him in a category, present and still proving. Victor, in his own way, kept proving too. He wrote a short note to the philanthropic committee about altering the fund allocation to include childcare support for artist residents, a detail he had not considered at the outset. He had his team discreetly set up a line of communication so that Elizabeth could request last-minute support for emergencies. He was not present at every rehearsal. He did not make this about himself. Yet sometimes, in the quiet moments of an office, he would pick up a photograph that lay face down in the drawer, a picture of a street on Fletcher Street where he had played as a boy, a photograph of a woman humming without words. And he would remember how small alterations of fortune can tilt a life. The due date approached with that slow, thrilling menace that pregnancy holds, a calendar page torn toward an unknown margin. Elizabeth counted weeks with the same care she reserved for lesson plans. She rearranged gigs around prenatal checkups. She practiced scales with her hand to her belly, feeling how the baby's movements corresponded almost instinctively to the sound. She painted the spare wall of 412 a color that was plain and unshowy, a place where a crib and a lamp might feel at home. Friends, neighbors from the Harrington staff, Margaret James, brought a baby blanket made of squares, each sewn by a different pair of hands. It hung over the back of a chair like a promise. Labor arrived on an ordinary morning when the sky was the color of a tired sheet. Linda and Maria were both with her. Dr. Reeves fielded the call and promised to meet them at the hospital. Victor sent a brief message through his admin. If you need anything, arrange through Meridian. And then, privately, he found himself at a small bedside in a hospital some hours later, not as a financier, but as a man who had learned to stand in the wings of consequence. He sat and watched the monitors like someone trying to learn a new language of patience. The delivery was honest and not cinematic. There were contractions that came and went like ocean swells and a nurse who bent to Elizabeth with a competence that felt like a patient tool. Daniel arrived, not on time but in time, with a florist bouquet that smelled faintly of apology. He stood in the corridor and washed his hands, and then knelt beside Elizabeth's bed, with a hand that trembled in a way that had nothing to do with his alcohol-free promises, and everything to do with a man learning the weight of responsibility. "You're doing it," he said, voice thin. We are, she corrected him. The word was inclusive and measured. The baby came with a cry that filled the small room, and made Victor look up as if hearing a bell in a church he had never chosen to enter. The nurses wrapped her in a towel, showed her forehead to her mother, and handed her over. Elizabeth stared down, tears pooling in a way that felt like relief rather than victory. She had kept a private vow that she would not let the baby's world be defined by the desperation that had cut through the bench nights. She had kept the promise without the illusion that life's edges would be smoothed overnight. You have a daughter, the nurse said. Clara. The name sounded like a piece of light. It fit her face. Daniel, who had never been able to say much in the thunder of guilt, voiced the name aloud and let it sit on his lips. Elizabeth watched him for a long moment and then, because life required forms and notes, asked gently, Will you be consistent? He looked at the swaddled child and said, Yes. Whether he would be remained a future tense. In the weeks after Clara's birth, the cadence of Elizabeth's life shifted into a new kind of careful choreography. There were late-night feedings and early morning lessons. Margaret adjusted schedules to include vocal rest. She would not allow Elizabeth to strain her voice in the early postpartum period. James came to the hospital the night Clara was born and sat at her bedside with a small tune arranged like a lullaby. He played softly while Elizabeth fed the baby. The sound felt like a benediction. The residency resumed when the various professionals agreed. Pediatrician appointments had been kept, Maria the sitter had ironed a schedule, and the Harrington manager had adjusted the times so Elizabeth would not be booked on nights she otherwise needed for the clinic. The residency manager, practical as ever, calculated the nights and wrote them into a spreadsheet that made music out of boxes checked. The months turned into a pattern. Elizabeth learned how to manage schedules that included pediatrics, rehearsals, practice time, and the small necessary pleasures of a life being built. She sent clips to meetings that Victor's team called periodic reviews, where the residency's progress was discussed in the language of numbers and attendance. The reviews were not comfortable. They required results. Elizabeth, who disliked being evaluated on a spreadsheet, met them with the same stoicism she used in song. There were contests of will. A night when groggy, Clara cried for reasons no one could parse, and Elizabeth missed a rehearsal. She called Margaret, who did not chide but rearranged a lesson and told her to come the following morning. There was a day when Daniel showed up to a review meeting looking like a man trying to keep his promises in real time. He had been to 2 parenting classes and had a small stack of coupons for baby supplies. Elizabeth acknowledged him but kept him on the slow path. Attendance plus proof. The more the schedule settled, the more Elizabeth's presence became a steady thing. She booked a small radio spot arranged by a friend of James's, something local and intimate. She recorded a demo in a spare studio that smelled of vinyl and coffee. Her voice, tempered by lessons, steadied by practice, came through as someone who had lived in the sound, not someone polished by convenience. The demo circulated among a few local venues. She earned modest fees, the kind that keep rent workable and groceries realistic. Victor watched these developments with a complex mixture of calculation and a quieter feeling that had to do with being accountable in a new way. He visited the Harrington once, not to supervise the residency, but because he wanted to see the small stage and how Elizabeth moved on it. He sat in the corner as the light warmed the room and watched her sing a set that was honest and full of the small techniques Margaret had emphasized. He did not applaud loudly when she finished. He nodded in the manner of a man who had learned to measure his gestures. Outside of the performance cycles, there were the ordinary bindings of life. A neighbor complained about a late-night delivery once. Elizabeth apologized and rearranged a pickup schedule. Someone on social media wrote about the evening she had been discovered, and columnists debated whether the spectacle had been orchestrated. Such conversations orbited around the margins of her life and rarely touched the substance of her days. The work, the practice, the diapers, the bank account that finally bore regular deposits. On a crisp autumn night, months after the wedding, the Harrington announced an evening to celebrate new voices. Elizabeth's set would be more substantial, an hour long with a maid on piano and a little narrative between songs about the journey. The crowd that night was not 500 with chandeliers and crystal. It was a cross-section of the city's lonely and regulars, couples on dates, older men with newspaper edges, a woman from the clinic who had nodded at Elizabeth across the waiting room months ago, and Margaret in a back seat with a smile that had become a private emblem. Elizabeth stood before the stage, clutching a glass of water in the same way she had once clutched a broom. Clara was at home with Maria, safe and sleeping. She thought of every incremental step, the envelope, the key with the number 412, the lessons, the nights of practice with a baby monitor on mute nearby, Daniel's fits and starts, Victor's clauses, and quiet. She thought of her mother's wordless songs, braided into the frames of each note. She thought of the promise she had made on a bench 2 winters ago, to keep a part of herself unbroken for her child. And she felt that promise held. James laid down the first chords, simple, unadorned, and Elizabeth's voice rose, no longer raw with the ache of survival but shaped with the authority of someone who knew her instrument. She sang wordless passages and arranged lyrics that had become quiet, honest stories. She told between songs about small things, a key found in a pocket, the smell of lemon cleaner, a cousin's blanket. She did not ask the room for pity. She simply offered the truth of her life and let it be heard. The room listened in the ongoing way that the smaller gatherings of a city listen, when they are not being told to notice. A man who had once been a skeptic of Victor's tests sat with a softened face. A woman in the front row, who had come because she'd liked a friend's post online, watched with a steady, attentive look. The standing ovation that night was not a tidal wave, but a steady, warm clap that moved through the space like heat. Margaret wiped her cheek. James smiled without pomp. Backstage after the set, people who had been hands in the process came through like chapters of support. Patricia with a practical handshake and an envelope of future gig dates. Thomas with a small paper bag of sandwiches he'd brought personally because he had seen too many nights of missed meals. Linda with a thermos of soup and the kind of pride that cousins reserve for kin who have done the honest work. Victor was there that night in the wings, the man who had once put a number on silence and turned it into a contract. He did not speak much. He reached out and offered a card with a phone number and a short note. Let's negotiate the next block. No promises beyond the terms. It was the kind of support that respected the scaffolding, not a savior's flourish, but a boardroom's handshake made small. Elizabeth took the card and slid it into her wallet next to the worn photograph of her mother's hands. People would later tell different versions of the story, that a beggar had been dining tableside to stardom. But the truth Elizabeth carried was less tidy. The check had not been a miracle in itself. It had been a lever that, combined with her voice and the choices she made, shifted the field of possibility. The Harrington nights were real work. Set lists, rehearsals, nights when she had to be both a mother and an artist, compromises made and refused. Daniel was part of the picture but not a frame. He came when he could and proved slowly, with small constancies that he could be trusted occasionally. Clara grew, a quiet child who liked James's piano more than most toys. Elizabeth would sometimes sing to her in the small apartment while she rocked the baby in a chair that faced the window where morning light came in like permission. She would practice scattered phrases with one hand and smooth the baby's tiny head with the other. In those moments, she felt the accumulation of the months like a warmth in her ribs. The work, the contracts, the neighbor's kindness, the serious adjustments of Victor's office. It was not a tidy redemption, it was a life in progress. One night, months after her first residency nights, a small television host called asking for an interview. The request felt sudden and oddly irrelevant to Elizabeth's private life. She agreed on the condition that they not make the story into a spectacle of charity. She wanted to talk about music, not about the envelope. The host obliged, and the segment aired to modest local viewership. A few more doors opened, small gigs at private events, an invitation from a local community arts festival, a commission to record a short song for a fundraiser. Each was measured and steady. At the festival, as she walked on stage to a small grassy amphitheater under string lights, She looked out and saw faces. Linda waving, Margaret clapping, James in the wings, Patricia in the shadow of a tent watching with a managerial smile. Victor sat farther back, anonymous in a jacket that cost more than some people earned in a year. And yet there he was, listening. Elizabeth sang the lullaby she had learned as a child, the wordless song that had held both hunger and consolation. She sang with an authority tempered by labor, and when the final note dissolved into the night, there was applause. Not the performance of a fabricated miracle, but the honest recognition of someone who had made rigorous work out of talent. After the set, she walked down the steps and held Clara up like a small living signpost. People walked over and touched the baby's hair, as if there was a contagious hope in the smallness of her fingers. Daniel stood at a respectful distance, and Elizabeth smiled in the way one smiles when someone is given a chance to be better. She had built boundaries in a rhythm that allowed compassion without surrender. Victor later made a targeted adjustment to his philanthropic practices. He funded a small community artists fund, designed to underwrite training and childcare for low-income artists. A structural idea that felt like a lesson learned from one messy human case. He held a briefing and asked Meridian to track outcomes in a way he could measure. He did not write any op-eds or make a public ceremony of it. It fit his pattern of doing good in measurable increments. For some, the gesture would remain questionable. For Elizabeth, it was simply another tool she could use toward stability. The residency continued into the following year. Elizabeth's name began to appear on small posters around town. A particular cafe hosted a Sunday afternoon where she performed and then stayed to sign a few vinyls. She had not been made into a star overnight, nor had she been taught that money erased work. She had been given the chance to do the work with professionals who demanded professional standards. The consequence was a life that contained both the ordinary struggles and the slow sense of progress. On an evening when the Harringtons' little stage glowed with a homey light, Elizabeth walked out to a room that had come to know her voice. She took a breath and sang the line that had once been a promise to herself, had once been a vow whispered into a blanket on a bench. When the final applause came, it was not a single tidal wave, but a layered standing of people who had watched a life build itself out of the labor of song and the arithmetic of careful support. Margaret hugged her. James grinned. Linda cried. Daniel, who had been present the night before to hold Clara for an hour, stood and clapped with a sort of relief that comes from the slow accretion of effort. Elizabeth stepped forward and took a bow. It was not the bow of someone who had been rescued by a single check or a single moment. It was the bow of someone who had shown up again and again, who had said no to easy shortcuts, and who had accepted help as scaffolding rather than as a finality. She had built, with a cautious mixture of talent and tenacity, a small scaffolding from which to launch a life. She left the stage and walked into the wings where Victor waited, not with fanfare, but with the subdued bearing of a man who had learned to steward consequences. He extended his hand, and she shook it, a simple gesture between two people who had been part of each other's trajectories for different reasons. "Well done," he said. It was short, accurate praise. "So are you," she replied, in a way that meant she acknowledged his part, but also reminded him gently of the work still to be done. Outside the Harrington, the night smelled of rain and lemon. Elizabeth walked home with Clara asleep in a sling at her chest, the city's light off the wet pavement like a promise that did not require certainty. In the small apartment at 412, the lamp Linda had brought threw a warm oval against the painted wall. She tucked the baby into a small bassinet and sat at the tiny table where her sheet music lay, notes folded like maps. She thought of the bench by the river, of the bread shared on a cold night, of the envelope folded in a pocket. She thought of the vow she had kept in the face of hunger, and the conditions she had written into contracts, so her life would not be rearranged by someone else's idea of generosity. She thought of the way a community, caseworkers, teachers, cousins, pianists, and an oddly decisive billionaire, had aligned in imperfect ways to make a path. Elizabeth finished the evening by singing softly, the lullaby she had always carried. Clara stirred and answered with a small, contented sound. It was not a miraculous erasure of hardship. It was the sound of a life being built tastefully, unapologetically. One payment stub, one lesson, one pediatric visit at a time. If you want to follow Elizabeth and Clara's journey and hear more stories like this, subscribe to our channel and share this video with someone who believes in practical hope.